Hey everyone, today we're going to look at the main riff and the verse riff from the song Mr. Brightside by the Killers. I've heard this song a bunch of times on the radio in my car, and it's got some pretty complex guitar lines that I think are emo adjacent. So I will analyze the riffs, explaining to you the music theory and how the riffs work, and from there you'll have some nice takeaways that you can use to write music that sounds like that. Anyways, let's get into it. Alright, to start things off, let me play you the main riff. It sounds like this. So as you can see, that is a very pretty and very twinkly line. The song is written in the key of D flat major and is played in standard tuning, dropped down a half step. So all of the notes of standard tuning are just lowered a half step. For example, E is now tuned down to E flat. Now in terms of how the guitar riff is written, in my opinion, it is based around this really cool D flat add 9 chord. This is really the ticket to everything here. So I think the guitarist found this chord shape and then decided to try and build a riff around it by creating some movement around it with some changing bass notes and a really cool picking pattern. So if we take a look at the structure here, basically what is going to happen is our top 4 notes are going to stay the same throughout the riff, and we're going to change the bass note in order to create a sense of movement. So basically, again, we have all of these sounds that are basically getting pivoted around with this descending bass line here. And if we want, we can also take a look at some of the individual characteristics of the harmony here. So for example, this chord here is the 1 chord in the key of D flat. It's a D flat add 9 chord. If we wanted to talk about the rest of the changes as unique chords, I guess we could say that this chord here is a D flat major 7 chord over C. So still the 1 chord, but in an inversion. And then we could say that we go to the 4 chord here, and we could call this a G flat major 13 chord. So we have the root, we have the 7, we have the 5, then we have the 13, and that is doubled. Or you could just think about this again as the D flat add 9 chord with the G flat in the bass. So again, in terms of the technique that I would say is going on here, I think the guitarist found a cool shape and is basically doing what I would call pivoting, where you change the bass note in order to create some movement around the sound. Now, in terms of why this riff sounds so good, I think we can get some clues by looking at the melodic intervals that are inside the D flat add 9 chord. So if I look at the second note here, this F, and the third note, this D flat, we have a 6th, which is a pretty interesting interval to have inside a chord. If we go from this note here, D flat, to this note E flat, we have a 2nd, which is also an interesting interval to have in a chord. So we have 2 really interesting and unique intervals inside this chord shape, which are giving us a really interesting, unique sound. If anything, a little bit of a dissonance here with this 2nd. So as a general rule of thumb, for me, any chord that has a 6th interval or a 2nd interval is going to sound pretty good. So some of my favorite shapes, for example, this chord here, 2nd inversion major 7 has a 6th, and it has a 2nd right here, giving us this cool crunch. Another one of my favorite shapes is this major 7 sus2 shape, which has a 2nd and then a 6th. So if we could combine those intervals, you're going to get a really nice sound. Or this major 9 shape, which is one of my favorite major 9 voicings. This one has a really nice 2nd right in there, which helps it to sound really cool. So again, the melodic intervals inside this chord help it to sound really unique and interesting. Now another really good device in the riff here is the way that the bass notes are used. So they descend, which creates this cool falling effect, which to me sounds very emo-y. And on the last 16th note, before every chord change, we have a bass note that gets played by this open D flat note. So if I play the riff view again, just listen to how there's da 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 da. So we're basically playing a pickup into the next chord change, which kind of gives us a beat that's like. So to me, that creates a really nice driving rhythm inside the line here, and it creates for a more dynamic bass line. If you play the bass line on its own, it's basically going to sound like this. So I'll try to play it for you one more time. Ugh. It's a hard line to play, but as you hopefully heard, you can hear that bass line, which is pushing into the next chord, giving us some really driving rhythm. So anyways, that is the analysis of the main riff. Let's move on now to the verse riff. Okay, let's listen to the verse riff. It sounds like this. So as you can see, the structure of this line here is pretty much the same as the main riff. We have the exact same picking pattern, and we still have a set of core 4 notes in the upper register that we are essentially pivoting on. So for our first sound here, we start with a B flat note in the bass, which gives us a B flat minor sound with an 11 on it, played by that open E flat sound. And then for our next one, we have an A flat sus4. So this time the A flat is in the bass, which would represent 5. And then for the last one here, we have a real handbreaker, which is apparently how the guitarist actually plays this. And we put the 4 in the bass, or G flat, and this gives us a G flat 6 sound. So in terms of tropes, again, a lot of pivoting. So we find a core sound and we basically create some movement around it. Another important thing to mention is obviously the use of open notes. So if you really want that twinkly sound, you have to have open notes in your shapes and in your lines. So both this and the main riff use a lot of open notes. I mean, we have this repeating E flat note that is ringing out open throughout the entire thing, and we have this open D flat sound here too. And again, we have the descending bass line, so that creates a really nice sense of falling and this kind of sense of, I guess, like melancholy as it moves down towards the 4 here. Now, before we end, I just want to show you another example of using this technique. So basically, it's just the equivalent, again, of finding a chord shape. Like if I take this shape here, and I move the bass note, I move the bass note again, and move the bass note again, right? So again, if you want to write an idea that kind of sounds like these two lines here, start with a really great chord shape and see what you can do by just moving some of the bass notes around. If you do that, you'll get something that sounds similar to this that will definitely give you this kind of effect. So anyways, that is the lesson on Mr. Brightside by The Killers. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.